Columbia County, New York. It's still dark before dawn, and the forest breathes mist across the old hollows and ridges. These hills rise like ridges of memory, quiet, ancient, persistent. I hold in my hands a basket. It's a large, rounded basket woven from narrow strips of white oak and hickory. Every strand and every knot feels like a message. This basket is valuable. Today it might sell for hundreds, even $1,000 among collectors. But it was never made for sale. It was made to endure. The hands that made this belong to people the world refused to understand. In the early decades of the 20th century, newspapers across New York printed stories about a group of people who lived deep in these hills, living apart from the towns, the churches, the schools. They called them names like Pondshiners and bushwhackers, and made claim after claim about their beliefs, their behavior, their way of life. The only enduring legacy left by these people is the baskets they made. Fine workmanship that rivals anything produced by more celebrated artisans. Before there was ever a drive through these hills, before Lake Taghkanic State Park drew summer visitors, these ridges were wild and sparsely inhabited. The town, known today as Taghkanic, sits within Columbia County, a land largely forested and hilly, named in the language of the Mohican people as a place of abundant water. But somewhere in this landscape, between the forests and the fields, lived a group of families who chose to withdraw, not merely to be alone, but to live their lives far from neighbors, far from institutions, far from curiosity itself. The settlers who stayed in the towns of Taghkanic and Gallatin saw these people only rarely. When they did, they saw only their backs as they disappeared deeper into the woods. And the stories they told were shaped as much by imagination as by fact. Local lore, recorded decades later, names these people the Pondshiners, a name no one seems able to explain with certainty. Some accounts suggest it referred to their preference for living near remote ponds. Others whispered it was a derisive label applied by townspeople who seldom understood them. In period newspaper clippings preserved in the Columbia County Historical Society and in archives of the New York Tribune, the Pondshiners were described in stark terms: the bushwhackers of Columbia County. Strange people populate Taghkanic hills. They have no religion, no morals, no education, and run like rabbits at the approach of strangers. But as we will see, such reports tell us far more about the observers than the observed. By the time the New York State Police were organized in 1917, these hill people had already lived in relative isolation for generations. When troopers accompanied journalists into the Taghkanic woods to investigate alleged crimes, most of which would never be substantiated, their reports only intensified widespread rumors about the Pondshiners' supposed backwoods ways. And yet, when asked about their origins, even members of this group often said they could not say how their families first came to live in these hills. Some suggested descent from Palatine settlers, others from Dutch families long established in the Hudson Valley. What is beyond dispute, what survives in both story and artifact, is the skill of the basket makers. Their rounded baskets, woven from hardwood strips, are both sturdy and elegant. In the early 1900s, they were sold in local markets, sometimes mistaken for shaker baskets because of the quality of their construction. These baskets were not mere commercial crafts. They were fundamental tools of survival, used for carrying crops, firewood, game, even water. To examine them is to see the labor of every season. The ash trees felled in winter, the strips split at stooped benches, the rims shaped at the creek side. Yet the baskets, unlike the people who made them, would outlast the changes sweeping through the region. rumors begin in the early 19th century. They always begin the same way, with a place people don't quite understand. Up on what locals simply called the Hill, an isolated ridge overlooking what is now Lake Taghkanic State Park, lived a small cluster of families. Not one family, not a single household, but several, bound together not by any known church or town record, but by proximity and shared distance from everyone else. Their names appear again and again in old documents. The Hotelings, the Proppers, the Simmons, the Snyders, names that still exist in Columbia County today, though most descendants live far from the hill their ancestors once called home. No one could say with certainty where these families came from. Some stories claimed they fled Connecticut to escape strict religious laws. Others said they were drawn north during the anti-rent wars of the 1830s and 1840s, when tenant farmers rebelled against wealthy landowners in the Hudson Valley. And when later writers asked the families themselves, the answers were often the same. They didn't know, not because they refused to say, but because memory itself had worn thin. If the people unsettled their neighbors, the baskets confused them. These were not crude objects. They were not rushed. They were not the work of someone unfamiliar with patience. Each basket was round-bottomed with a subtle rise at the center, a form designed to sit securely on uneven ground. They were made from white oak and ash, split by hand into long, narrow splints. No machines, no molds. Just muscle, memory, and repetition passed down over generations. The rims were tightly lashed, the handles balanced weight perfectly. The weave was dense enough to hold grain, produce firewood, even water for short distances. People who bought them noticed something else. No two baskets were exactly the same. Eventually, the hill needed a name. People began calling its residents the Pondshiners. No one ever wrote down where the word came from. Some said it referred to the water, the ponds and lakes near their homes. Others suggested it was a mocking term, shaped by fear more than meaning. There were other names too. Bushwhackers, hill people, the frightened ones. Labels applied from the outside, rarely chosen by those who carried them. Maps from the late 1700s and early 1800s show the same surnames clustered in the same area. Census records list occupations vaguely, if they list them at all. Laborer, basketmaker, sometimes nothing. Generation after generation lived on land considered too rocky and steep for profitable farming. They survived by hunting, fishing, seasonal labor, and weaving baskets that found their way into nearly every household in the surrounding towns. And yet, by the early 1900s, something shifts. Newspaper articles describe the Pondshiners not as neighbors, but as a problem. Stories speak of isolation as if it were evidence, of quiet as if it were intent, of difference as if it were danger. Authorities begin to take interest, so do journalists. And once a story like that takes hold, it no longer belongs to the people being described. Were these families simply private? Or was there something about life on the hill that truly frightened the people below? The records don't answer that question. In 1919, more than 100 miles south of the Taghkanic Hills, a reporter in New York City heard a rumor. His name was Frederick Van de Water. Van de Water wrote for the New York Tribune, one of the most widely read newspapers in the country. He had built a career on stories about law enforcement, order, and the boundaries between civilization and what lay beyond it. When he heard whispers about strange families living in the hills of Columbia County, he understood immediately what he had found. Not a community, a story about people who lived apart, a story about fear, a story that could travel. Van de Water did not begin by visiting the hill. He began by imagining it. And when he finally went north, he did not go alone. He went with the New York State Troopers, the Gray Riders, a newly formed force still establishing its authority in rural New York. What Van de Water would later write about this trip appeared first as newspaper articles and then as a chapter in his 1922 book, Gray Riders, the story of the New York State Troopers. He called the chapter The Frightened People. Van de Water described the hill this way. The hills were laced with little blind paths running in and out of ravines, between boulders, twisting and branching endlessly. These were the highways of the frightened people, used for mysterious ends of their own. It was effective writing, and it did something important. It transformed geography into intent. From that moment on, the story no longer belonged to the people who lived there. Van de Water's articles were published with headlines meant to stop readers mid-sentence. They have no religion, no morals, no education. They run like rabbits at the approach of strangers. The words traveled farther than the hill ever could. Soon, other papers repeated the claims. And then came the additions, stories of strange rituals, stories of backward customs, stories of danger hiding in the trees. There was no evidence for any of it, but evidence was no longer required. When Van de Water described hidden trails used for unknown ends, he was likely describing what any rural community builds when roads are scarce. Paths. When he described people avoiding armed strangers, escorted by state troopers, he framed it as guilt rather than caution. And with every paragraph, ordinary survival became something else entirely. What was happening was subtle. Poverty became proof. Privacy became accusation. Difference became danger. And once a label like that is printed, it does not stay on the page. The story did not stop with words. In the early 1920s, the attention turned official. State troopers returned to the hill, this time not as observers but as enforcers. New York's truancy laws required all children to attend school. The same society that had called these families backward now insisted they become something else. Children from the hill were brought into classrooms where their names were already known, and not kindly. They were called Pondshiners, bushwhackers, names meant to remind them where they came from. Many of them did what children do when survival requires it. They adapted. They stopped talking about the hill. They stopped making baskets. They stopped teaching their children the skills that had sustained their families for generations. Not because they wanted to forget, because they wanted the attention to stop. Emotional pause. And it did. The newspapers moved on. The troopers stopped coming. The hill grew quiet. But when the noise faded, so did the tradition. By the middle of the 20th century, the Pondshiners were no longer a story anyone told. Only the baskets remained, and even they were beginning to disappear.